In September 1833, a printer named Benjamin Day did something that made every publisher in New York think he'd lost his mind. He dropped the price of a newspaper to 1 cent. Not 6 cents. Not 5. 1. Newspapers at the time were luxury subscriptions paid months in advance, written for merchants and politicians, read in parlors by people who already had power. Day's paper, the New York Sun, wasn't for them. It was for clerks, dock workers, immigrants who'd just gotten off a boat. He didn't sell it by subscription. He sold it on the street, one copy at a time, shouted out by boys who kept a cut of every sale. People laughed. A newspaper that cheap couldn't survive. Within 2 years, it had the highest circulation of any newspaper on earth. That 1 cent gamble didn't just build a business. It built an entire idea. That news wasn't a privilege for the powerful. It was something ordinary people had a right to know, every single morning, for the price of a coin. Over the next 180 years, that idea would grow into one of the most powerful industries in human history. It would topple governments, end presidencies, and employ hundreds of thousands of people whose entire job was to find the truth and print it. And then, in about 15 years, almost all of it would disappear. This is the story of the newspaper industry. How a penny made it rise, and how a decision, made quietly by a few engineers with no interest in journalism at all, brought it down. To understand how that happened, you have to start at the beginning. All the way back to that 1 cent. Benjamin Day's 1 cent trick spread fast. Within a few years, cheap mass-market papers, nicknamed the penny press, were fighting for readers in every major American city. And they fought dirty. Sensational headlines, crime stories, gossip, anything that would sell on a street corner. But underneath the noise, something genuinely new was happening. For the first time, information was moving at the speed of a machine instead of the speed of a horse. The invention of the telegraph in the 1840s meant a newspaper in New York could print news from Washington the same day it happened. A new organization called the Associated Press let competing papers pool the cost of gathering news from across a growing country, then race each other to print it first. By the end of the century, 2 men, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, turned newspapers into empires. Their rivalry got so fierce, so theatrical. Historians still call the style of reporting they invented yellow journalism. It was messy. It was sometimes irresponsible. It also built the template every newspaper on the planet would follow for the next 100 years. Sell papers to everyone, fund the operation with advertising, and let advertising, not the reader, pay the real bills. That last part mattered more than anyone realized at the time. It would make newspapers rich beyond imagination. And decades later, it would be the exact seam where the entire industry came apart. But that was still a long way off. First, newspapers had an entire century of dominance to build. By the middle of the 20th century, the newspaper wasn't just a product. It was a fixture of daily life, as ordinary and expected as electricity or running water. Nearly every city of any size had at least one paper, often 2 or 3, competing for the same porches every morning. And the business model underneath it was, frankly, one of the best in the history of commerce. Local advertisers had almost nowhere else to go. If you were selling a used car, hiring a secretary, or listing a house for sale, the newspaper classified section was the only place in town anyone would see it. Economists later gave this arrangement a name, a local monopoly. In most cities, one paper controlled the flow of both news and advertising, and it could charge accordingly. The ratio tells the story better than any description could. At the industry's healthiest point, newspapers were pulling in roughly $4 in advertising for every $1 readers paid in subscriptions. The reader was never really the customer. The reader was the product, the audience that advertisers were paying to reach. Radio didn't kill that model. Television, when it arrived, didn't kill it either. Newspapers simply absorbed the competition and kept growing. By 1990, the industry felt less like a business and more like a permanent institution, as durable as a courthouse or a bank. Reporters brought down a sitting American president. Papers won Pulitzer Prizes for investigations that took years and cost fortunes to run. And newspapers could afford to run them, because the money never seemed to stop coming. Nobody inside that industry was looking for a threat. Why would they be? They controlled something no one else could replicate. The only printed record of a city, delivered to every doorstep every single day. That confidence was about to become the most expensive mistake in the industry's history. By the year 2000, American newspapers were generating somewhere around $65 to $73 billion a year in advertising revenue alone. Let that number sit for a second. Not total revenue, just advertising. That's more than the GDP of many entire countries, generated by an industry built on cheap paper and printing presses, some of which hadn't fundamentally changed in design for 100 years. Classified ads, the want ads, the car listings, the apartment rentals, made up roughly 40% of that money by themselves. One single unglamorous section of tiny gray text was, on its own, one of the most profitable products in American media. Newsrooms had never been bigger. By the late 2000s, more than 70,000 people worked as newspaper journalists in the United States alone. Investigators, war correspondents, city hall reporters, photographers stationed in bureaus around the world. Papers were thick. Sunday editions could run past 100 pages. Executives spoke about the business, only half-jokingly, as a cash cow, the safest, most predictable revenue in all of media. And in 1995, 5 years before that peak, a soft-spoken software engineer named Craig Newmark had started something small. Not a company, not even really a business, just an email list sent to a few friends in San Francisco, sharing local events and apartment listings. He called it Craigslist. Almost nobody in the newspaper industry noticed, and the ones who did weren't worried. It's worth sitting with that moment for a second, because it's the hinge the entire story turns on. Craigslist, at first glance, was nothing. No design. No sales team, no glossy front page, just plain blue links on a white background and listings that anyone could post for free. Compared to a 100-page Sunday newspaper with color photography and 100 years of institutional trust behind it, it looked less like a competitor and more like a hobby project that would embarrass itself and disappear. Newspaper executives who bothered to look at it reached, almost universally, the same conclusion. This changes nothing. It had no professional journalism, no editorial standards, no brand. Why would a want ad section built on volunteer trust ever threaten the most reliable revenue stream in American media? They were asking the wrong question. The question was never whether Craigslist was a better product than the classified section of a newspaper. The question was whether it was free, and whether good enough plus free could beat excellent plus a price tag. It could. It did over and over, city by city, for more than a decade. By some industry estimates, classified advertising alone represented tens of billions of dollars a year at its height. Within a decade, most of it was simply gone. Not shrunk, gone, migrated to free listing sites, then to Google, then to social platforms that could target and add to one single person instead of an entire city. And classifieds were only the first domino. Once readers started getting news for free online too, first from newspapers' own websites, given away without a real plan to charge for it, and then from an explosion of blogs, aggregators, and eventually social media, the second, larger pillar of the business, display advertising, began to crack as well. Newspapers hadn't lost a war. They'd never shown up to fight one. By the time most of them understood what Craigslist actually was, it was no longer a threat. It was already the new normal. The numbers, once the fall started, are almost hard to say out loud. Newspaper advertising revenue in the United States peaked at roughly $49 to $73 billion, depending on how you measure it, in the mid-2000s. By 2020, that number had collapsed to somewhere between $9 and $10 billion. By 2023, some measurements put total print advertising as low as $6 billion, a decline of more than 90% from the industry's high point, in less time than it takes a child to finish high school. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis didn't create the newspaper industry's problem. Craigslist and the internet had already done that, but it acted like gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Local businesses, the backbone of print advertising for 100 years, slashed budgets overnight. Between 2008 and 2019 alone, newspaper newsroom employment fell by more than half, from roughly 71,000 journalists to around 35,000. Entire investigative teams, entire foreign bureaus, entire city hall beats, gone in barely a decade. The physical toll was just as stark. More than 3,200 American newspapers closed between 2005 and 2024. That's not 3,200 headlines. That's 3,200 towns and cities that woke up one day and no longer had anyone paid to sit through a school board meeting, or a city council vote, or a criminal trial, and report back on what happened. Researchers gave that phenomenon a name too: news deserts. Places where local journalism simply stopped existing. Today, an estimated 55 million Americans live in a county with little or no local news coverage at all. The industry that once broke presidents, employed small armies of reporters, and generated more cash than most nations' economies had, in less than 2 decades, lost the vast majority of both its money and its people. But this isn't quite where the story ends. Here's the story of a single collapsing product, a phone, a company, a stock, doesn't usually have. Newspapers didn't vanish. They didn't get to. What they lost was the golden, effortless version of the business. The one where a local monopoly on classified ads paid for everything and nobody had to ask a reader to open their wallet. What survived had to relearn how to actually earn a reader's money, one subscription at a time. The way Benjamin Day's 1-cent papers once earned it 1 coin at a time. Some did it. Large national papers built digital subscription models that now bring in millions of paying readers who never touch a printed page. By the early 2020s, digital advertising made up nearly half of all newspaper ad revenue. Still a fraction of the old total, but proof the model wasn't entirely dead, just smaller and rebuilt from different materials. At the local level, the picture is more mixed and more fragile. Some cities lost their only paper entirely. Others were rescued by something the founders of the penny press would barely recognize. Nonprofit newsrooms, reader-funded outlets, journalists starting newsletters directly to their own subscribers, cutting out the printing press altogether. The newspaper industry's story isn't really the story of a technology that died. It's the story of a business model, one built on a single brilliant idea in 1833 that a century and a half of success quietly turned into a blind spot. The people running it didn't fail to see the future because they were foolish. They failed to see it because the present was too comfortable, too profitable, too obviously working, right up until the moment it wasn't. That's not just a story about newspapers. It's the story of almost every empire that has ever assumed the thing that made it powerful would keep making it powerful forever. Benjamin Day sold the truth for 1 cent and built an institution that outlasted him by nearly 2 centuries. It just turned out that the hardest thing an institution can ever do is notice when the price of everything around it has quietly dropped to zero. That's the story of the newspaper today. And if you enjoyed uncovering the incredible story behind one of the famous industry in the world, make sure to subscribe, because there are countless everyday things with extraordinary stories still waiting to be told. And until the next journey, thanks for watching.